Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty fascinating, I think.
Yeah,
The philosophy of the Buddha himself.
that's right.
But, going beyond just like the surface level, Buddhism.
Absolutely.
And to help us really unpack all this, we're going to be using an excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy,
Yeah,
which is
great source.
kind of a super in-depth, peer-reviewed Wikipedia for philosophers, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resource. I mean, for getting a clear and accurate understanding of some really complex philosophical ideas.
Right.
And in this case, I think it's going to help us understand what really made the Buddha tick,
Yeah.
not just as this spiritual figure, but as a thinker who was really grappling with life's biggest questions.
Exactly. So get ready to have your mind stretched because we're about to discover how the Buddha's ideas about suffering and the self and even rebirth are surprisingly relevant to our lives today,
Hmm.
even if you don't consider yourself a Buddhist.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the Buddha wasn't just, spouting wisdom from thin air.
Right.
He was part of this movement called the Shiramanas that was really reacting against the traditional Vedic rituals and beliefs of his time.
Okay.
So you have to kind of imagine ancient India, right? This place that was just buzzing with spiritual seeking where people
Yeah.
were really starting to question the old ways.
Yeah. I mean, so the Buddha was born into this world of privilege, right?
He was.
But instead of just accepting the status quo, he walks away from it all. He becomes a seeker driven by this desire to understand the nature of suffering and the path to liberation.
Yeah.
It's makes you wonder, if there's a lesson there for all of us.
Absolutely. And that path to liberation, as many of you might know, is outlined in the Four Noble Truths.
Good.
And the first truth, is that suffering exists.
Right.
And you might be thinking, well, duh, that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But the Buddha wasn't just talking about physical pain or, emotional distress.
Right. It's much deeper than that. It's about that sense of dissatisfaction that we all experience.
Yeah.
The feeling that something's just not quite right, no matter how much we achieve or acquire.
Yeah,
He saw this as like an inherent part of the human condition.
absolutely. And the second truth, the origin of suffering, is where the Buddha's philosophical arguments get really interesting.
Okay.
This is where he really digs into the why of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And his answer, in a nutshell, is the self, or rather the illusion of self.
Okay, hold on a second. Is he saying that we don't actually exist?
Not quite. It's more nuanced than that.
No,
See,
then.
the Buddha's concept of anatman, or non-self, argues that this idea we have of a solid, unchanging I
Yeah.
is actually an illusion, a misunderstanding of reality.
Okay.
Think about it this way, like, have you ever noticed how much of your suffering comes from clinging to this idea of a fixed self?
Hmm.
We worry about what people think of me. We fear losing my possessions.
Right.
We get attached to my beliefs.
Yeah, it's like we're building our entire lives on a foundation that's constantly shifting.
Exactly.
And that, according to the Buddha, is a recipe for suffering.
Yes.
But he didn't just make this claim out of the blue, right? He actually presented some pretty compelling arguments to support his view.
He did. The source material we're using highlights two key arguments, the argument from impermanence and the argument from control.
Okay.
So the first one, the argument from impermanence, basically says that if there were a real unchanging self, it would have to be permanent.
Right.
But everything we experience, our bodies, our thoughts, our feelings, they're all constantly changing.
So if everything about us is in flux,
Yeah.
how can there be a permanent, unchanging self at our core?
Right. It's like trying to hold on to water.
Yeah,
The harder you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers.
exactly. And then there's the argument from control.
Yeah.
If we truly had a solid self, we should be able to control it completely, right?
Right.
If I decide to be happy, I should just be able to snap my fingers and make
Now
it
we
so.
just-
But we all know that's not how it works.
No.
Our minds and bodies often have a mind of their own,
Yes.
rebelling against our best intentions.
All the time.
This lack of control, the Buddha argued, suggests that maybe this I we think we're in charge of isn't as real or as powerful as we imagine.
And what's even more intriguing is that the Buddha wasn't proposing a typical mind-body dualism like many other philosophers of his time.
Okay.
He didn't see the mind as some separate eternal entity.
Right.
Instead, he saw it as a constant flow of mental events, just as impermanent as everything else.
So if there's no fixed self, no unchanging mind, then what happens when we die? Does anything carry over?
Right. This is where the concepts of karma and rebirth come into play, and where things start to get really interesting.
Okay, so we've established that this idea of a fixed self is kind of an illusion.
Right.
Now, how does that square with this idea of karma and rebirth?
Yeah.
I mean, you said that the person in this life and the next is neither the same nor different.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
that's pretty mind-boggling.
It is. And this is where this concept of the two truths comes in.
Okay.
Um, think about it this way. Like we talk about tables and chairs
Right.
as if they're like solid, independent things, right?
Yeah.
But on a deeper level, they're just collections of atoms constantly in motion.
So there's like the everyday reality that we experience,
Right.
and then there's kind of this underlying reality, the way things actually are.
Exactly. You got so you have the conventional truth and then you have the ultimate truth.
Okay.
And this applies to us as well.
Okay.
On a conventional level, we exist as these seemingly separate individuals, right?
Yeah.
But on an ultimate level, we're a constantly changing flow of physical and mental processes interconnected with everything around us.
So there's no fixed me being reborn, but rather a continuation of this flow of cause and effect
Yeah.
that we call karma.
Precisely, think of it like a wave in the ocean.
Okay.
Each wave has its own unique form, but it's also part of the larger ocean.
Right.
In the same way, each life is unique, but it's also part of a larger flow of existence.
That's a great analogy.
Thank you.
But if the Buddha was so into this logic and reasoning,
Yeah.
why didn't he just lay it all out like this?
Yeah,
There are times when he seems to downplay philosophical speculation.
that's true. You're right. It can seem like there's a tension there.
Yeah.
But I think it comes down to the fact that for the Buddha, the ultimate goal wasn't just intellectual understanding.
Mm-hmm.
It was liberation from suffering.
So he wasn't against using reason, but he also recognized its limits.
Yeah, one example of this is the famous fire simile. So imagine someone whose house is on fire.
Right.
Would they stand around debating the origins of fire?
Probably not.
Right. I think they'd be a little more focused on putting the fire out.
Yeah.
And that's what the Buddha is getting at. If you're consumed by the flames of suffering, endlessly speculating about these metaphysical questions
Yeah.
isn't going to help. You need to take action.
But the interesting thing is, even in dismissing those questions, he's using reason to point out the faulty assumptions behind them.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, hey, look at how these questions are trapping you.
Exactly. Questions like, where does the fire go when it goes out? Or what happens to the self after death? These
Right.
only make sense if you assume the fire or the self continues to exist in some form. He's challenging us to question the very framework we're using to understand reality.
This feels incredibly relevant today.
It does.
I mean, we're constantly bombarded with information, different opinions and belief systems. It's easy to get lost in the noise and lose sight of what truly matters.
Absolutely. The Buddha's approach offers a way to navigate this information overload.
Yeah.
He encourages us to question our assumptions, to examine the root causes of our suffering, and to use reason as a tool for liberation.
It's almost like a form of mental self-defense, isn't it?
Yeah, I like that.
Developing that critical thinking muscle to protect ourselves from harmful ideas and limiting beliefs.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just about intellectual detachment.
Okay.
The Buddha's philosophy is deeply intertwined with ethics and compassion.
So it's not just about understanding the concepts, it's about living them.
Precisely, the Buddha saw ignorance as the root of suffering.
Right.
And that ignorance isn't just about misunderstanding reality.
Yeah.
It's about failing to see the interconnectedness of all things. When we see ourselves as separate and independent, it's easy to act in ways that harm ourselves and others.
But when we recognize that we're all part of this web of life,
Right.
our actions take on a whole new meaning. This is where the concept of karma comes full circle.
It does.
Even though there's no fixed self, our choices still matter.
They do. They matter because they affect the entire web of existence,
Wow.
Our actions ripple outwards, creating a more just and compassionate world or a more selfish and harmful one.
That's powerful, and it's a message that resonates with me deeply, regardless of, any specific religious beliefs.
It's a universal call to wake up, to see things as they truly are, and to live in a way that benefits all beings.
I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all this incredible information.
I bet.
In a good way, of course.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here?
Well, one question I think is worth pondering is this. If the Buddha's right, and our sense of self is ultimately an illusion, does that make our actions less meaningful?
That's a great question. Or could it be that realizing the illusory nature of the self actually makes our actions more meaningful, more selfless?
That's something I think we all need to explore for ourselves.
I have a feeling this conversation is far from over, but for now, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned.
Okay.
The Buddhist philosophy challenges us to look beyond our usual ways of seeing the world and
It
ourselves.
does. It invites us to question our assumptions, to embrace change, and to live with greater awareness and compassion.
Yeah, it's like by letting go of this fixed idea of the self, we can actually become more present, more connected to the world around us.
It is a paradox, right? We often think that the self is the source of our meaning and our
Yeah.
purpose. But what if clinging to that self is actually what's preventing us from experiencing true freedom and fulfillment?
So instead of being driven by ego and self-preservation, our actions could become more about genuine compassion and connection.
Precisely. It's a shift from, what's in it for me to how can I contribute to the well-being of all beings?
That's a pretty radical way of thinking, but it's also incredibly inspiring.
It is.
It makes you realize that even though life is impermanent, our actions still have the power to make a difference.
And it reminds us that, true happiness isn't about accumulating wealth or possessions
Right.
or even achieving some kind of static state of enlightenment. It's
Yeah.
about living in alignment with our deepest values, acting with kindness and wisdom moment to moment.
So after this incredible deep dive into the Buddhist philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
I'm left with a sense of both awe and possibility. Awe at the depth and complexity of these ideas,
Yeah.
and a sense of possibility for how they can inform our lives, even if we don't consider ourselves Buddhists.
It's amazing how these teachings, which originated thousands of years ago, still feel so relevant,
Right.
even urgent in today's world.
Absolutely. And I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity to explore these ideas further.
Mm,
Don't just take our word for it. Dive into the source material yourself. Read the sutras.
right.
Engage with different interpretations. But I mean, there's a whole world of wisdom out there just waiting to be discovered.
And remember, the beauty of philosophy is that it's an ongoing conversation, a journey of discovery that never really ends.
Yeah, I love that.
So keep those minds curious, those hearts open, and keep exploring.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of Buddhist philosophy.
Huh.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep living a life that matters.